Bien, como ven, non se libran tan facilmente de mí. Tócame agora presentar a noso conferenciante principal, o Dr. Geoffrey Yeo, do cual teño aquí unha extensísima biobibliografía que voy a glosar porque es demasiado para recitar o leer. Geoffrey Yeo perhaps is not exactly the correct pronunciation.
Correct, yes, that's
Yeah?
correct.
Okay. Es individuo honorario y senior de investigación senior en la Universidad College de Londres, donde fue docente y director de programas de máster y de certificados en archivos y gestión documental y de archivos y gestión documental en la Escuela de Estudios de Información, Archivos y Bibliotecas en dicho Colegio Universitario de Londres. También tiene una experiencia profesional dilatada, porque fue archivero en la Corporación de la Ciudad de Londres y en el Hospital San Bartolomé en Londres y en el Real Colegio de Médicos. También trabajó como archivero en gestión documental libre y como consultor para el International Records Management Trust y participó como tal consultor en proyectos educativos y de gestión documental en una serie de países de África, Gambia, Ghana, Botswana, Uganda, en el marco de conseguir materiales educativos para utilizar en países en vías de desarrollo en toda la Commonwealth. En el 2010 fue profesor visitante en la Escuela de Estudios de Información, Archivos y Bibliotecas de la Universidad de British Columbia. Como veis, por lo tanto, pasamos de Europa al África anglosajona, pasamos a la América de tradición inglesa y también algo francesa, todo hay que decir, hay que vincular el aspecto francófono también de Canadá. Sus publicaciones son extensísimas sobre temas variados en torno a los archivos y la gestión documental, incluyendo conceptualización de documentos, valoración, descripción, uso, comprensión conceptual de los documentos, archivo, información, prueba, performatividad de los documentos y su papel en las acciones sociales, historia de la gestión documental, ideas de la práctica de la gestión documental, retos y oportunidades para producir, conservar y usar los documentos y los archivos en contornos digitales. Bueno, todo un mundo que gira en torno precisamente a los archivos y a su conceptualización. Ha sido conferenciante habitual sobre estas y otras materias relacionadas en conferencias internacionales, académicas y profesionales. Y como no podía ser de otro modo, ha ganado una serie de premios muy significativos que por el nombre, el título que llevan, se entenderá sobre su relevancia. Por ejemplo, el premio Ernst Posner en el 2009, o el premio Hugh Taylor Prize en el 2013, o el premio al artículo de historia archivística de la Sociedad de Archivísticas Americanas en el 2022-23 y el premio al trabajo en investigación Bob Williams en el 23. Supongo que seguirá recibiendo premios en años sucesivos, porque estos dos últimos han sido los más recientitos. Y con todo esto, solo me queda dar la bienvenida al profesor Yeo, pedirle que comience su conferencia para gratificarnos con ella. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be here today, and I feel very honoured that the organisers of this event have invited me to share some thoughts with you. In my talk, I will address two of the four themes from our programme. I will speak about artificial intelligence and about concepts of archives. I am not a computer scientist, and I won't attempt to discuss the technical complexities of artificial intelligence or to analyse its various technological components. Instead, I would like to consider how developments in artificial intelligence relate to our archival practices and concepts, and whether they might perhaps lead us to conceptualize archives in a different way. I would guess that some of you are probably very knowledgeable about artificial intelligence, while others may know very little. So I must ask those who are already familiar with the subject to excuse me if I begin by offering a basic introduction to artificial intelligence for the benefit of those who are less expert. What do we mean by artificial intelligence? The American National Standard Dictionary of Information Technology defines it as the capacity of a device to perform functions normally associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning, learning, and self-improvement. The European Parliament has defined an artificial intelligence system as a machine-based system that is designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy and that can generate outputs such as predictions, recommendations, or decisions. The United Kingdom government's view of such systems has also focused on their autonomy, together with another characteristic which it calls adaptivity. Adaptivity refers to the ability of these systems to infer patterns and connections, and perhaps to make new forms of inference not envisaged by their human programmers. Autonomy refers to their ability to make decisions without the express intent or ongoing control of a human. Artificial intelligence is widely said to offer transformative possibilities on an unprecedented scale. It has been heralded as a means of enhancing creativity and innovation, while also achieving productivity gains and cost reductions. In industry, it has potential uses in, for example, design, manufacturing, marketing, and sales. In the public services, uses have been identified in areas as diverse as policing, justice, traffic management, and healthcare. It can also be applied in many cultural fields, including art, music, and literature. In the university sector, it has uses for teaching, writing grant applications, statistical analysis, and a range of other purposes connected with academic research. More generally, in a speech delivered only a few days ago, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak affirmed that it will bring new opportunities for economic growth, new advances in human capability, and the chance to solve problems that we once thought beyond us. But there are also anxieties about the risks that can be associated with artificial intelligence systems. According to a policy paper issued by the United Kingdom government earlier this year, their adaptivity can make it difficult to explain the logic of a system's outcomes, while their autonomy can obstruct attempts to assign responsibility for the system's actions. So while governments around the world remain very alert to the benefits that artificial intelligence is expected to bring, many of them have growing concerns about its inherent dangers. Among various national and regional responses to these dangers, one of the most comprehensive is the Artificial Intelligence Act proposed by the European Union. At the time of composing this presentation, the new law is not yet in force, but since it seems likely to be enacted very soon, we can usefully examine its intended framework. Broadly speaking, the new Act seeks to identify low risk, limited risk, high risk, and unacceptable practices. Unacceptable practices are those that are likely to cause physical or psychological harm or are deemed to endanger fundamental human rights. They include the use of subliminal or manipulative techniques, practices that aim to exploit vulnerable groups such as children or persons with disabilities, so-called social scoring systems, which set out to evaluate the trustworthiness of individuals based on their social behaviour, and certain uses of biometric or facial recognition systems, such as their remote deployment in public spaces. With very limited exceptions, these applications of artificial intelligence are to be prohibited when the Act is passed into law. High-risk systems are the main focus of the proposed legislation and are defined mainly in terms of the sectors where they will be used. These include transport, education, employment and welfare rights, law enforcement, and the administration of justice. Systems designed for these areas will not be banned, but will be subject to strict obligations in terms of risk assessment and security precautions. And in addition, strong documentation obligations will apply to those who provide and operate them. There will be requirements for the logging of activity to ensure the traceability of results, and for the retention of these logs for an appropriate period. Providers of high-risk systems will also be expected to supply comprehensive documentation, not only of the systems themselves, but also of the data sets used to build them. It has been proposed that the European Commission should maintain a publicly accessible database where such documentation will be lodged. Limited risk systems will have more minimal transparency requirements designed simply to allow users to make informed decisions about whether they wish to interact with the system in question. Most discussions about the systems that will fall into this category have focused on what are often called generative and deep fake artificial intelligence. Generative artificial intelligence refers to systems used to generate textual content, such as news articles, research papers, literary works, or real-time responses to questions posed in online chat. Content that may appear to be generated by a human being, when in fact it is created by a computer. Deep fake artificial intelligence generally refers to a system that creates or manipulates images or audio or video recordings in ways that lead them to represent events that have never occurred, or to depict people saying or doing things that they have never said or done. And users of such systems can easily be misled into believing that they are interacting with another person when they are actually interacting with artificial intelligence, or into believing that content is authentic when it is not. To mitigate these risks, the new legislation requires that interfaces are designed and deployed in such a way that users will always be aware that they are dealing with an artificial intelligence system. Some exceptions have been proposed, for example, when deep fakes are used for self-evidently creative or artistic reasons, or when artificial intelligence is used to support crime detection. But in general, the proposed approach is to counteract the risks of impersonation or deception by introducing obligations for transparency. And finally, there are artificial intelligence systems which present low or minimal levels of risk, at least in the opinion of the European legislators. These include spam filters, most artificial intelligence-enabled computer games, and in the workplace arena, systems that support relatively mundane functions such as stock control and inventory management. European policymakers have suggested that codes of conduct should be developed for low-risk systems, but in general, these systems fall outside the scope of the proposed legislation. So in short, the goal of the legislators is to achieve a balance between the need to mitigate the risks of artificial intelligence and the desire to encourage its use as a means of boosting innovation and productivity. Similar concerns will almost certainly underlie other legislation that is likely to be enacted elsewhere in the world. Inevitably, however, much of the European Union's draft law remains contentious. In the media and in wider public debate, questions are being asked both about artificial intelligence in general and about the European legislators' response to it. Is seeking to regulate its use by categorizing levels of risk the right approach? Are the four proposed categories mutually exclusive? How will regulators deal with borderline cases or with general purpose artificial intelligence systems that can be used in a variety of contexts? Do the proposed measures deal adequately with the risk of bias? Should we find the whole movement towards artificial intelligence deeply worrying, whether in terms of its possible exploitation by criminals and terrorist groups, in terms of expected job losses among skilled workers, or in terms of a seismic shift from human responsibility to automated decision-making? Are the proposed control mechanisms robust enough? Isn't it likely that even so-called low-risk systems will need to be closely controlled at a level far beyond what is currently proposed? These are important questions for the future of human society, and we may perhaps want to discuss some of them in our conversations over the next 2 days. But my understanding, wait a moment, I think that's wrong. Let's just go back. Yes, there we go. Important as they undoubtedly are, these questions will not be the centerpiece of my talk this morning. My topic is more closely focused on our own field, and my aim will be to encourage you to consider how artificial intelligence is relevant to archivists and to the world of archives. Very broadly, I think there are 3 aspects of artificial intelligence that should be of particular interest to the archival profession. And the first of these relates directly to the kinds of safeguards and precautions that the European legislation addresses. You will have noticed that when I was speaking about this legislation a few minutes ago, I mentioned its requirement for both the design and the use of high-risk artificial intelligence systems to be fully documented. And it seems to me that careful and thorough documentation of high-risk systems will be of crucial importance in the coming years. And although the legislation doesn't mention archives or archivists, I believe that there will be a key role for our profession in making sure that documentation of this kind is complete and accurate, that it is securely captured and properly maintained, and that it is preserved for as long as it will be needed. The legislation proposes that in the interest of traceability, all activity logs should be kept for at least 6 months, which shows that the lawmakers haven't wholly overlooked preservation issues. But I'm sure that many archivists will want to argue that the documentation of high-risk systems should be retained for a much longer period, and that at least some of it should be preserved indefinitely. Besides our concern with preserving system documentation, there is a further element in the draft legislation which I think will attract the notice of archivists. I mentioned that the legislation proposes to categorize so-called deep fake artificial intelligence as limited risk. And I imagine that I may not be the only person here today to find this surprising. Let me quote Dan Cooper and his colleagues from the American multinational law firm of Covington and Burling. Deep fake artificial intelligence, these lawyers say, features natural persons appearing to say or do something they have never said or done in a manner that would falsely appear to be authentic. In the traditional language of archivists, deep fakes are forgeries. They purport to be something they are not, and users of them who are not alert to their falsity are likely to be deceived. Let us pause for a moment to consider this. Ever since the days of the Roman Empire, forgery has been considered a serious crime. In the digest of the Emperor Justinian, forging a public document was deemed to constitute treason. Here in Spain, in Visigothic times, forgery of documents incurred a penalty of at least 100 lashes, and in some cases, forgers were condemned to become the slaves of those they had set out to deceive. Today, of course, we wouldn't want to impose such draconian penalties, but perpetrating deceit by means of forgery remains a matter that should not be lightly dismissed. Now, not every deepfake is created with deceptive intent, but deepfake technologies undoubtedly open up many possibilities for deceit, and from an archivist's perspective, describing them as limited risk seems a severe underestimation of the dangers that they bring. If archival professionals are truly concerned about the reliability and the trustworthiness of future historical resources, this is an issue on which we should be lobbying our political representatives. Right, moving on from the proposed European legislation, the second aspect of artificial intelligence that has important consequences for archivists is its use in an ever-growing range of work practices. Artificial intelligence tools will significantly alter the ways in which documentation is created in the workplace. And there are many possible examples, but I will mention just 3. In the field of recruitment, artificial intelligence can be deployed not merely in the initial sifting of job applications, but also in the use of robots to conduct interviews, a practice that is already underway in some municipalities in Sweden. In Estonia, there have been discussions about the possibility of using artificial intelligence tools in place of human judges in courts of law, at least for financial cases involving relatively small sums of money. And similar developments have also been reported in China. And those of you who have been following the debates about blockchain will doubtless be familiar with so-called smart contracts, forms of contract that are made on behalf of organizations without any direct human intervention, and which are increasingly powered by artificial intelligence. All these developments and many others like them will affect the shape of future documentation of these activities, as well as the contexts in which it is generated. This documentation will need to be managed, and at least some of it can be expected to warrant long-term archival preservation. So these changes will have a profound impact on the materials that future archivists will receive and the ways in which these materials may be contextualized and interpreted. And the third aspect that is of great interest to archivists is the potential for using artificial intelligence in our response to the explosive increase in the numbers of documents that are now being created. In the digital age, these quantities exceed anything we have experienced in the past, and we need to find ways of managing and providing access to documents and archives on an unprecedented scale. Consider, for example, the American presidential emails held by the National Archives of the United States. Covering a period of more than 30 years, there are estimated to be 600 million of these emails, of which less than 0.1% are currently available for public access. Governments in other countries have almost certainly used email and other messaging systems on a similar scale. And archival institutions may soon be faced with collections of emails numbering in the billions. So given the limited resources available to most archivists, how can we be expected to appraise materials in such vast quantities? And when we have decided which sets of documents will be kept, how will we be able to preserve and give access to them? How will we sustain their findability, usability, and integrity over time, while ensuring appropriate levels of privacy and confidentiality? I won't try to give detailed answers to these questions this morning, but I would like to address them strategically and to argue that we won't be able to cope with the vast increase in the quantity of documentation using traditional handcrafted approaches. Scaling up our established practices will not be an option. Responses to the challenges we will face will require us to look to computer science and the use of automated techniques, especially artificial intelligence tools. As yet, of course, there are few such tools designed specifically for archival purposes, although a growth in their availability can be expected in the future. To date, most work by archivists has focused on adapting tools built for other purposes. So image recognition systems have been used by several archival institutions. AV has systems for transcribing audio or handwritten text. E-discovery systems have also received a lot of attention. These are designed to review large collections of documents. And whilst their primary function is to identify items relevant to legislation or to litigation, there have been expectations that they could be repurposed to meet other needs for document classification and retrieval. And more recently, firms such as Microsoft have begun to incorporate artificial intelligence into their operating systems, email clients, cloud storage. And some commentators now expect that as these tools develop, it will be possible to leverage them as a basis for intelligent digital archives. Besides archivists, users of archives will be able to employ tools of this kind. Of course, challenges will arise in acquiring the skills and the technical capacity to use these tools. For many archivists, implementing them will also demand cultural adjustment. Some archivists are already resisting the notion of entrusting computers with tasks that have long been the domain of human judgment. And particular concerns have been expressed about artificial intelligence tools that aim to identify sensitive or confidential files in large digital archives. Many commentators are far from certain that these tools are trustworthy. Similar anxiety has been voiced about attempts to automate appraisal. Stakeholders may be unwilling to trust disposal decisions based on algorithmic analysis. Some archivists have argued that where digital resources are concerned, an emphasis on disposal is out of keeping with the spirit of our times. But others affirm that it remains necessary, but that decisions about the deletion or destruction of documents and the selection of future archives cannot safely be left to computer programs. These are important concerns which our profession must now address. But we must also accept that in an age of digital profusion, we will not be able to acquire the preservation and access solutions that we need unless we harness appropriate technological tools. So, after this brief overview of the practical applications of artificial intelligence, I now want to shift my focus to archival theory. If artificial intelligence will have such a huge impact on our daily work, how might it affect our professional thinking? More specifically, will it oblige us to revise our conceptual understandings of what archives are and how they function, as some recent commentators have suggested? Well, before I can attempt to answer these questions, I need to acknowledge that existing concepts of archives are very diverse. And I will spend a little time exploring what people mean when they use the word archives today. And I think it will also be helpful to examine how the word has been understood in the past. As I'm sure you know, its origins lie way back in ancient Greece, where the word archaeon was used to refer to a place where documents were stored and made available for consultation. The Greek word archaeon gave rise to the Latin archivum, which in turn was the origin of archivo in Spanish, archive in English, and similar words in other modern European languages. In classical times, archives were essentially repositories. In a definition used over many centuries, an archivum was said to be locus in quo acta publica asservantur, a place in which public acts are conserved. But as time passed, however, the word acquired a wider range of meanings. The material holdings of repositories also came to be labelled as archives. And in an unfortunate terminological confusion, archives were seen as places that preserve and give access to archives. As far as I know, this extension of meaning has occurred in almost every European language. If I speak in French of les archives, or in Italian of an archivio, it isn't immediately obvious whether I am referring to a place, to the materials held in that place, or indeed to both. We might have expected usage to be less ambiguous in English-speaking countries because the English language offers the word records to describe the materials held in archival repositories. As early as 1671, the English writer Edward Chamberlain described the Tower of London as the great archive where are conserved all the records of the court. But despite this, the double meaning of archives was established in England by the end of the 17th century. Chamberlain could equally well have described the Tower of London as an archive where archives are conserved. In our own era, when American archivist Caitlin Patterson undertook a survey of perceptions of archives in Washington State in 2016, more than 2/3 of her respondents identified archives primarily as documents or materials. Fewer than 1 in 6 identified them as places or institutions. Well, since the 17th century, when Chamberlain's book was published, the range of meaning of archives has undergone several further shifts. Historically, in every country where the word was used, it carried an association with public acts or with documents kept by government institutions. But more recently, it has become commonplace to accept that archives can also be maintained by businesses, non-profit organisations, families, and individual persons. A further extension occurred when the word archive came to connote the totality of the documents created or received by an institution, family, or person, irrespective of where those documents were stored or whether they were all stored in a single place. An archive might be moved from place to place. It might be scattered across a number of working offices. Its ownership might be divided, with different parts of the archive passing into the hands of different individuals or institutions. But conceptually, it could still be identified as a single archive. Particularly in the 20th century, some people have wanted to limit the scope of archives to documents that have been identified as historically valuable, documents that merit long-term retention, or documents that have been formally transferred to an archival repository. But others now insist that these restrictions are unduly limiting and that the status of an archive does not depend on its historical value, its long-term preservation, or its custodial arrangements. Debates have also arisen about the extent to which archives, in the sense of materials or documents, can be described as natural or organic accumulations. 20th century archivists insisted that the growth of an archive was a natural process, but today this assumption seems open to dispute. Individual documents in an archive may perhaps be said to have come into existence more or less naturally as life or business progressed, but decisions about which documents were to be kept and how they were to be organised and presented to users are based on fallible human judgment. In parallel with this, many archivists have moved away from conceptions of archives as rigidly arranged entities and have begun to seek more flexible ways of addressing their context and provenance. And in the 21st century, the shift to understanding archives as materials rather than institutions has also encouraged scholars to examine non-traditional or non-Western ways of maintaining archives or preserving memories. In seeking to redefine archives to accommodate these alternative perspectives, some scholars not only deprecate institutional custody, but also de-emphasize the keeping of what in English are called records. Some have argued that archives are assemblages of any objects deemed significant by those who assemble them. Others affirm that the term archives embraces not only collections of objects, but also a range of memory-related practices in multiple forms. 21st century understandings of archives have been further complicated by computer scientists, cultural theorists, and others who have appropriated the word archive for their own purposes. And we will hear more about this afternoon when other speakers will share their thoughts on conceptualizations of archives in philosophy and art. And I don't want to trespass on their territory, so I will just talk briefly about conceptualizations of archives, or more usually, conceptualizations of the archive, in the singular, in other disciplines apart from art and philosophy. So in computer science, an archive can be a backup copy, a set of files or data sets stored offline, or a part of a website that displays superseded content. Digital humanities scholars, audio-visual curators, and digital librarians have also adopted the word and use it to describe collections that have little resemblance to archives as archivists have traditionally understood them. A body of literature, for example, or a collection of soundtracks drawn from a variety of sources may be described as an archive. In the view of cultural historian Suzanne Marchand, an archive in its widest sense is any collection of data brought together to resist its being lost to memory. Literary scholar Thomas Tansell takes this further and argues that all artifacts form one vast archive, the tangible residue of the activities of humanity. And in the 21st century, in the wake of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, cultural theorists have rendered the concept of the archive into a metaphor for almost any protocol used for controlling knowledge or exercising hegemony. Nowadays, as cultural historian Julieta Singh has observed, archive can mean almost anything. Archivists' responses to these developments have often been unenthusiastic. Some have simply ignored them. Some have vociferously objected to the appropriation of a key concept of our discipline by scholars in other fields. Some have pointed out that most writings about the archive by scholars of literature, art, or cultural theory show little awareness of archival science as a discipline with an extensive literature of its own. Others, however, have adopted some of the ideas put forward by non-archivists and have incorporated notions about archives from other disciplines into their own thinking. Rightly or wrongly, perceptions of archives as an inclusive concept, embracing a much wider range of materials than archivists traditionally believed, are rapidly gaining popularity among archival scholars. So in the years that lie ahead, new conceptualizations of archives will almost certainly continue to appear, both within and outside the professional community of archivists. I think it is very likely that some, perhaps many, of these new conceptualizations will be influenced in some way by the growth of artificial intelligence. But will artificial intelligence be the sole or even the main force that drives them? On this question, I feel much more doubtful. Artificial intelligence will have major effects on our working lives, but I believe that its effects will be felt mainly at the level of professional practice. I am far from sure that it will be the chief determinant of conceptual change. To explain my misgivings on this point, I hope you will allow me to look back into the past once more. Some of you will remember that when digital technology first became commonplace, many pundits told us that the transition to a digital world would require a radical revision of our concepts of archives. And undoubtedly, early digital technologies hastened some shifts in our understanding of what an archive might be. We became more aware, for example, that archives were not necessarily composed only of documents, but could also encompass sets of structured data. And yet, archivists had long known that archival materials were not always in the physical form of documents, but could include many other formats, ranging from the knotted cords of the Incas to 20th century video and audio recordings. In this sense, the digital revolution did not so much demand a different understanding of archives. Rather, it gave renewed emphasis to understandings that we already possessed. And much the same, I think, will happen with the growth of artificial intelligence. Earlier in this talk, I mentioned a shift away from the notion that the arrangement of an archive is necessarily stable and singular. Some commentators have noted that artificial intelligence tools will enhance our ability to reorganize and reaggregate the components of an archive to meet the requirements of different stakeholders. Instead of a single arrangement, a so-called original order, we will be able to have multiple arrangements simultaneously. Artificial intelligence will make it easy to put into practice our new understanding that no single ordering of an archive can capture the multiple relationships of archival materials or serve the multiple needs of their diverse users. But although we can expect artificial intelligence to facilitate this at a practical level, the artificial intelligence revolution did not give birth to the underlying conceptual understanding which had already emerged from an intellectual environment that owed as much to postmodernism and inclusivity models as to developments in technology. One archival concept that will almost certainly be affected by the advent of artificial intelligence is the belief that only natural or juridical persons can participate in the creation of archival documents. In English-speaking countries, this belief now carries little weight, but in those continental European countries where it still prevails, the apparent ability of artificial intelligence systems to generate contracts and other documents without having the status of legal personhood would seem to make a reconsideration of traditional ideas inevitable. In general, however, I'm not convinced that artificial intelligence will require a fundamental reinvention of conceptual ideas about archives. Consider the questions relating to deepfakes, which I spoke about earlier. Archivists clearly need to be aware of the dangers that deepfake artificial intelligence may bring. We may also need to refine our practical methods of identifying and categorizing forgeries in order to respond to these dangers. But at a conceptual level, at the level of understanding what we mean by concepts such as authenticity, reliability, and trustworthiness, the issues that arise from deepfake technology are no different from those that arise from other modes of falsification that have been used in the past. Even in the era of artificial intelligence, archives will still represent and emerge from activities and events that take place in the world. Their provenance and their contextual relationships will still need to be safeguarded alongside their content and structure. They will continue to fulfill important roles in society because there will still be demands for the evidence and information they can provide, the accountability they can support, and the aids to memory they can supply. And they will remain potential sources of controversy, not least because they often operate as instruments of power and authority, and because they sometimes bring trauma as well as knowledge and edification. So it is at the practical, not the conceptual level, that I think our response to artificial intelligence needs to be focused. We must consider how we can best ensure the capture of relevant documentation from artificial intelligence systems. We must explore ways of managing what we capture, perhaps using artificial intelligence tools to manage the outputs of other artificial intelligence tools. And we must remember that we do not simply require search tools, we need tools to support digital preservation and tools that can provide overviews of complex aggregations and uncover their interrelationships. As yet, we have little understanding of the cultural and emotional responses that such tools will evoke. But we can expect that if we can acquire confidence in them, these technologies will increasingly overcome the difficulties of maintaining digital documents on an extended scale. Computational methods will allow us to give access to large digital archives by facilitating tasks that would otherwise be impossibly laborious. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Geoffrey Yeo, por su espléndida conferencia, que tiene dos virtudes, uno su contenido y otro el haberse ceñido estrictamente al tiempo programado. Gracias de nuevo por estas dos cuestiones y les indico que ahora hay una pausa para café que durará hasta las 12, en que comenzará la primera sesión sobre archivos e inteligencia artificial como continuación de esta espléndida conferencia. Gracias, muchas gracias de nuevo.
May I just quickly add that if anyone has any questions about my presentation, do please come up to me in the coffee break and we will try to cross the linguistic boundary and deal with questions. I'm more than happy to discuss any of these issues with you. Sadly, I don't speak Spanish, but as well as English, I can hold a conversation in French if that's helpful to anyone here. And I'd be very happy to carry on the discussion, the debate, over coffee or at later times in the course of the conference. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Por si había alguna, si hay alguna pregunta que formular al profesor Yeo en este momento, era un momento adecuado porque tenemos de margen unos 10 minutos y podíamos aprovechar.
Oh, excellent. Very good. I thought we were going for coffee straight away.
Si no fuese así, pues continuamos en el café y si hay oportunidades para intercambiar opiniones, las aprovecharemos. Bueno, vamos a por el café. Ah, no, aquí hay un voluntario. Gabriel Quiroga quiere preguntar algo. Sí.
Sí, bo día. Nada, moitas gracias ao profesor Yeo por a súa magnífica conferencia. No, eu quería, en relación con esa dialéctica entre os riscos e as oportunidades que a inteligencia artificial nos brinda aos arquivistas e en xeral a arquivística, non podemos ignorar que o sector privado no mundo da inteligencia artificial ten un papel moi importante e todos os gobernos do mundo están moi preocupados ao respecto e estamos vendo estes días como os problemas en determinadas empresas precursoras da inteligencia artificial móvense nesa dialéctica entre si desenvolvela rapidamente ou ir pouco a pouco polos riscos que... Pero eu o que me pregunto é se o desenvolvemento da inteligencia artificial en relación cos arquivos non pode ser acentuar as desigualdades que existen hoxe en día xa no mundo co desenvolvemento dos medios informáticos para o desenvolvemento dos arquivos e que non acentúe esa desigualdade que existe xa no seo dos propios países onde vemos diferentes estadios de desenvolvemento en canto arquivístico ou a disponibilidade ou non de medios para estar pues, por ejemplo, para desenvolver a administración electrónica e entre os diferentes países do mundo. E iso, o desenvolvemento da inteligencia artificial non cree que poda incrementar e aumentar ese risco de desigualdade no mundo sobre o control da memoria colectiva.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Our esteemed chairman mentioned that I've had the good fortune in past years to work in a number of African countries, and that has very much opened my eyes to the vast divide, the vast discrepancy in resources between what you may expect to have access to in a developed country such as Spain or England, and the situation that you find in poorer regions of the world. And I do fear that artificial intelligence is going to add to, at least in the short run, is going to add to rather than help to resolve some of these global inequalities. I think in the longer run, things will probably even themselves up, because certainly since I first started working in Africa, it's been quite interesting to see how technology has improved and developed even in the most low resource countries in the world. But there is always a gap, and it is clearly correct that the possession of artificial intelligence tools gives a level of global advantages to those countries with developed infrastructures. So yes, absolutely, there is an issue there. It's something that we, and I think particularly organizations such as the International Council on Archives, will need to be very aware of, to take into account. I'm not sure that it's a problem that we as a small and relatively under influential profession will be able to resolve by ourselves, but at the very least we can bear in mind that this is, I think, as important an issue as some of the risks and dangers that I actually mentioned in my presentation. I didn't mention that one because I was aware that I had to keep to time, as our chairman quite rightly pointed out, but I totally agree, there are concerns, very real concerns in that area.
¿Alguna otra cuestión? Sí, por allí, Nuria.
Buenos días. Sí, muchas gracias, profesor Yeo, por su intervención. Yo dos preguntas muy concretas, más de dudas. La primera es, me ha parecido entender que en el anteproyecto de ley europea que comentaba usted, se da por entendido que la manipulación de las imágenes sí que son de alto riesgo, ¿no? Pero en cambio la manipulación de documentos o la falsificación de documentos no, es como menor riesgo. Y usted mismo ha señalado, ¿no?, el peligro en este segundo aspecto de crear casi como nuevas fuentes documentales. ¿Es así? ¿Lo he entendido bien? Esta sería una primera pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta, cuando habla usted, por desconocimiento mío, perdón, cuando habla usted del registro de actividad que se tiene que conservar al menos 6 meses, según esta ley, ese registro de actividad es de todas las pruebas que se hacen con la IA. Yo estoy pensando en mis alumnos que están probando hacer los trabajos con IA. Eso también, es decir, es una pura ignorancia en este tema. La segunda pregunta. Muchas gracias.
Right, let me try and bear those two questions in mind. If I go off track, I can come back to you perhaps and ask you to repeat some of the questions. But the first question was about image manipulation systems. The European Union wishes to categorize them as limited risk. And this is where I see the danger arising. The European Union's approach does not see those systems as particularly dangerous, but it seems to me that there are some very real dangers there, and I suspect that many of us would share that view, that the risks are really considerably higher than the European legislators seem to think they are, which is rather worrying, to say the least. The second question was about the 6 months retention period, I think it's at least possible that that may change before the Act comes into law. But the proposal at the moment is for logs of activity created by artificial intelligence systems to be retained for a minimum period of 6 months. It leaves open the possibility of extending that period, but it doesn't discuss in any detail what an extended retention period might be. And in answer to the third question about students using artificial intelligence to write their essays, yes, I think that's a real concern. I was in University College the day before yesterday, just 2 days ago, and I really wanted to touch base with some of my former colleagues who are still teaching. I'm now retired from teaching, so I am spared having to worry about this on a personal basis. But I did want to ask some of my colleagues both how far they felt this practice was becoming prevalent and what actions, if any, they were taking to countermand it, because it did occur to me that this might come up as a topic of conversation in our meeting today. Sadly, when I went into University College, none of my colleagues were there, so I didn't have the opportunity to have that discussion. But it does seem to me that, yes, from the perspective of an educator, whether an educator in archives or indeed an educator in any other field, there are some really, really serious concerns here. For a long time, those of us who have had responsibilities for setting assignments to students and for marking students' work have been concerned at the ease with which texts can be copied from the internet into student essays and the growing prevalence of dubious companies that advertise essay writing services on the internet. And if you come across these things, but you can pay somebody in India or wherever to write your essay for you. And now along comes artificial intelligence to add to the mix of difficulties. And I think it's going to be the hardest one of the three to crack. The copying from the internet can be dealt with because there is now software that you can use, and those of you who are in education will no doubt be familiar with this. There is software that you can use. You can run a student essay through a checking algorithm that will come back with a score to give an indication as to whether the student has or has not lifted material from the internet. The essay writing bureaus, not much of a problem in archival science because they tend to be focused on the larger disciplines. If you're a law student, if you're a medical student, you can get your essay written for you if you pay enough money. If you're a student in archives, you probably can't find anybody who will be able to do that. But artificial intelligence as an essay writing aid, I think, is going to be very worrying. And I have to admit, I do not know what the answer is. If anyone else knows, I would be really interested to hear or indeed to discuss this, because I think it's an issue for our educators right now. It's here arriving even as we speak. These tools, even 12 months ago, were not available on the scale that they are now.
Well, very interesting. Anyway, we can continue discussing this subject in the coffee place, if you agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, vamos a continuar esta discusión tan interesante en el café, si les parece bien a todos. Y a las 12 estaremos todos aquí para continuar, bueno, todo el que quiera, evidentemente, para continuar con nuestra primera sesión. Muchas gracias a todos por su atención.